I worked as a doctor and conducted a health department. I had my own sentinel, my own system for monitoring flu diseases. And every year I observed how many people became sick in an area of 150,000 inhabitants. Every year, worldwide, we have new types of viruses because the viruses have to change themselves. If the same viruses came year after year, our immune systems would recognize them, so they would not be able to make us sick or to multiply, which is what they want. So they regularly have to change a bit, and that's why we have new variants of these viruses every year. There are about 100 different types of viruses that are changing constantly. Up to now, we really didn't care which viruses caused this flu or disease or however you want to call it.
But everything changed at the end of 2019, when reports of a novel coronavirus started to come from China. According to the official narrative, the new virus named SARS-CoV-2 was isolated in the Asian country on January 7, and was stated to be the cause of the new disease known as COVID-19. 5 days later, Chinese scientists shared the genetic sequence of the virus with the rest of the world. Immediately, companies began working on the development of polymerase chain reaction testing kits, also known as PCR. On March 3, as the outbreak was spreading rapidly around the globe, the World Health Organization made a stunning announcement.
Globally, about 3.4% of reported COVID-19 cases have died. By comparison, seasonal flu generally kills far fewer than 1% of those infected.
The statement sent shockwaves worldwide, resulting in a mass hysteria and panic. However, as many experts pointed out at the time, WHO's estimate was highly inflated, because up until then, PCR tests were still scarce, and only the sickest and most likely to die patients were tested, which made the disease look a lot more deadly than it actually was. Moreover, the data on which the WHO based their estimate showed huge variations in the fatality rate registered in different countries, from 0.6% in South Korea to 6% in the United States. This is an astounding tenfold difference, which clearly indicates just how inconsistent, unreliable and incomplete the statistics were at that time. Given all this, it is extremely perplexing how the World Health Organization could make such a staggeringly misleading statement. On March 11, they officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. 5 days later, Professor Neil Ferguson, along with his team of scientists at the Imperial College of London, presented a very dire epidemiological model, predicting an infection fatality rate of 0.9%, 9 times higher than that of seasonal flu. The researchers go on to explain that, in total, in an unmitigated epidemic, we would predict approximately 510,000 deaths in Great Britain, and 2.2 million in the US, not accounting for the potential negative effects of health systems being overwhelmed on mortality. Furthermore, the paper specifically stated that the only way to prevent such horrifying scenarios from coming to fruition was to implement full lockdown measures. Within days, it became apparent that authorities around the world have decided to follow this advice. However, many infectious disease experts were incredibly baffled by this, because Ferguson's model didn't even undergo any peer review process, which is the safeguard designed to prevent any unchecked, unsubstantiated, and erroneous scientific work from being published.
The paper was never published scientifically. It's not peer-reviewed, which a scientific paper should be. It's just an internal departmental report from Imperial. And it's fascinating. I don't think any other scientific endeavor has made such an impression on the world as that rather debatable paper. One thing that the model has missed is that it assumes that the hospital capacity will remain the same. And that's not what's happening anywhere. I mean, in Sweden, we've tripled our intensive care capacity, and I think that's happening in the UK as well. But the paper completely overlooks that.
Is your impression that it was overly pessimistic?
Yes. Oh, yes. Very much so.
What could have inspired Neil Ferguson to make the estimates that he made?
I have no clue. And I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories. So if you have a model that gives results that contradict everything else, then you contact your colleagues. You say, send me your model. Let me try it. Let me compare what we have. Where are we in agreement? And what is it that makes my model different from yours? This is how science works. We all make mistakes, but we don't present the results without first double-checking with what other people think and what other models say.
Within days of the release of the infamous report, expert modelers and software engineers requested from Ferguson to open source the code, but he flat out refused. The British professor explained on Twitter that the code is too clunky for others to review and comprehend, and needs to be updated before he can share it with the rest of the world. I am happy to say that Microsoft and GitHub are working with Imperial Judea and MRC Outbreak to document, refactor, and extend the code to allow others to use without the multiple days training it would currently require, and which we don't have time to give. Considering the immediate and unprecedented impact that Ferguson's report had on public policy worldwide, his decision to hide the original code is not just bizarre, but also highly suspicious. More than a month later, when the updated version of the code was posted on GitHub, multiple software engineers heavily criticized the codebase for being untested, full of bugs, and incapable of reproducing the same result twice. We can only wonder how much worse the original code was. Interestingly enough, this is not the first time Professor Ferguson published outrageously pessimistic predictions. In 2001, he warned of the dangers of foot and mouth disease in livestock. His advice on preventative measures resulted in the preemptive culling of 6.5 million animals, and cost the UK government a staggering £10 billion. The model was heavily criticised for being too unsubstantiated and costly. In 2005, the British epidemiologist announced that up to 200 million people could die from the bird flu worldwide. The virus ended up killing only 455 people globally. 4 years later, Neil Ferguson estimated that the mortality rate of the swine flu was between 0.3 and 1.5%. In actuality, the virus was found to have a mortality rate of 0.03%, which is 10 times less than the low end of his range. This leaves us with the inevitable question. How is it possible that Professor Neil Ferguson, having had such a horrible track record of ridiculous predictions, became the scientist whose model determined the global policy for the COVID-19 response? Only 3 days after the controversial model came out, a major French study was published, shedding light on the actual lethality of COVID-19.
To gauge the true danger of the virus, what is the type of data we need? Here are common coronaviruses that we live with every day. Here is COVID-19. What we need are, say, 10,000 patients, all with respiratory tract disease, that are infected with common coronaviruses, and 10,000 infected with COVID-19, all really with respiratory tract disease, nothing else. Then we need to ask how many die in this group and how many in that. If the mortality is similar in both, then clearly they are similarly dangerous or less dangerous. If the number here is higher, then obviously the virus is more dangerous. If the number is much higher, then obviously the virus is much more dangerous. You will ask me, has there been such a study? And I answer, no, until March 19th, 2020, when the first study ever appeared from our French colleagues that addressed this central question. What do you think they reported? The mortality in both groups was similar. COVID-19 did not differ in dangerousness from its everyday relatives.
Meanwhile, in Iceland, yet another big study was being conducted.
One setting that has emerged in the last few days is data from Iceland. And until the last data that I saw, they had an infection rate in the population of 0.9%, which you extrapolate to 360,000 people in the Icelandic population, it turns out to be about 3,500 people being infected. And of those, only one fatality has occurred so far. We have one death, and there's also some people who have some severe symptoms. One death corresponds to 0.03% infection fatality rate. Obviously, if there's more deaths, that will go up. But if you compare that to seasonal influenza, which is 0.10%, it doesn't look that bad.
Unfortunately, the French and Icelandic studies were completely ignored by those in charge of the COVID-19 response. By the end of March, most governments around the globe had imposed strict lockdown measures, which infuriated numerous medical experts.
Ferguson's numbers stood until the Oxford study challenged him. He came out the next day and said, I've reduced my estimate from 500,000 in the UK to 20,000. But this is because of social distancing. He must know better than to say that. No?
I don't know his personality.
Okay.
To know better means you have to question yourself. And some people are not capable of doing that. And that is dangerous.
It just seems so incredibly obviously disingenuous, even to a layperson, to say that, oh, my model has changed, but it's because we were so good in one day, because the social distancing had only happened for one day, and he was saying it's because maybe I can tell we're going to be so good. I mean, and therefore that's why it just doesn't make a damn bit of sense.
It does not make any sense.
One of your most intriguing contentions from our last interview was that peak infections had already been reached by the time containment was begun in a number of countries. Can you go over the evidence for that again, and maybe you want to show the CDC graph right now?
So, if the number of admissions or people showing up in a hospital peaks around March 18th, that means that the number of infections must have occurred on March 8th.
That's the top number of infections.
It takes a week until you have symptoms, and you don't go to the hospital with the first symptoms. You say, oh, I have a flu, I have a cold, whatever, it will be over soon. And then after 3 or 4 days, if it's not over, then you say, well, maybe it's something more serious, and then you go to the hospital. So what we see around the 18th must have been events or infections that were around the 8th. And if the infections peaked around the 8th, shutting down schools and restaurants and the economy about 10 days later is something that is totally absurd. In particular, if you know that 1 week later, only 1 week, not 10 days later, 1 week later, the curve was already clearly going down, indicating that the worst was already over. And if in an epidemic the worst is already over, to say, okay, then let's shut down the economy and cause 26 million people lose their jobs, because it's so fun seeing them losing their jobs, I think that is heartless.
Implementation of the current draconian measures that so extremely restrict fundamental rights can only be justified if there is reason to fear that a truly exponentially dangerous virus is threatening us. Do any scientifically sound data exist to support this contention for COVID-19? I assert that the answer is simply no.
A similar opinion was expressed by the German Network for Evidence-Based Medicine, an association of about 1,000 medical professionals, scientists, and researchers. Once again, there was no room for public debate, and no one in power took notice of these dissenting opinions. In the following weeks and months, newly published studies gave a lot more clarity on how dangerous SARS-CoV-2 is.
This study aimed to generate an estimate of how many people in Santa Clara County have been infected with the virus. And the way to find out is to try to see whether they have developed antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. And the sample was 3,300 people who came to be tested. We estimated that based on what we saw, between 2.5 and 4.2% of the population of the county has antibodies, which is an indication that they have been infected with the virus a while ago. We realized that the number of infected people is somewhere between 50 and 85 times more compared to what we thought, compared to what had been documented. Immediately, that means that the infection fatality rate, the chance of dying, the probability of dying if you are infected, diminishes by 50 to 85-fold, because the denominator in the calculation becomes 50 to 85-fold bigger. Our data suggests that COVID-19 has an infection fatality rate that is in the same ballpark as seasonal influenza.
To this day, the Trump administration, and I won't make a distinction between the Trump administration and Fauci and Dr. Birx, they are suggesting that, as is Neil Ferguson, that if we had not social distanced, we would in fact have seen 2 million deaths. Does your, in the United States, does your work suggest that the case fatality ratio with or without social distancing would mean that that was not the case? Does that what your serology study in California teaches us?
Both our serology study in California and several other studies that have started releasing some information about rates of infected people that are also very high in different locations around the world suggest that the infection fatality rate is very, very low. So these scenarios of 40 million deaths in the world and 2+ million deaths in the US by doing nothing are science fiction at the moment. I cannot describe them in any other terms.
With every passing month, the data kept piling up, and on the 5th of October, Dr. Mike Ryan, Executive Director of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program, made a very intriguing announcement.
Our current best estimates tell us that about 10% of the global population may have been infected by this virus.
In other words, given that the entire human population was about 7.8 billion people at the time of this statement, roughly 780 million people have been infected with the novel coronavirus worldwide. Up to that point, according to the official data, exactly 1,051,454 people had died of COVID-19. This means that even the World Health Organization's analysis indicates that the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 is about 0.13%, almost exactly the same as that of seasonal influenza. However, for some unexplained reason, this crucial finding failed to get the attention of government officials and medical authorities. 2 days after the stunning announcement made by the WHO, Professor John Ioannidis published a meta-analysis of 82 studies from around the world, and determined that the median IFR across 51 locations is 0.23% for the overall population. In other words, half of the locations show an IFR lower than 0.23%, and the other half, higher than 0.23%. In his paper, Professor Ioannidis points out that there are a few main reasons for the higher IFR found in some places. First and foremost, as explained earlier in the film, the COVID-19 death statistics in many countries are artificially boosted, by including many people who have died from other causes. This, of course, significantly increases the IFR of the disease, making it look a lot more lethal than it actually is. But even the highly inflated median infection fatality rate of 0.23% is still much lower than the 0.9% IFR estimated by Professor Neil Ferguson. Furthermore, Professor Ioannidis explains that a higher than usual IFR can also be the result of terrible mistakes such as sending sick COVID-19 patients to nursing homes, and putting people on mechanical ventilation when they don't need it. Italy is the perfect example of such calamitous mismanagement of the situation.
Italy has the most elderly population in Europe and one of the most elderly populations in the world. It is far more older people on average compared to a country like the US or most of the other countries. And we know very well that SARS-CoV-2 has markedly steep increase in mortality in people who are very old. The average age of people who die in Italy is 81 years old. And also, most of these people have lots of other underlying diseases. Italy is a country that has a very strong history of smoking. It has very high rates, therefore, of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It has very high rates of coronary heart disease. And these are very strong risk factors for having a bad outcome in this infection. If you want to transplant these data to another population, you need to account for that differential case mix and try to adjust accordingly what your expectation would be in a different country. There's also other things that probably got wrong in Italy. Italy has a relatively low number of ICU beds per population. It has about a third of ICU beds per population compared to the US. And their system is running at full capacity practically every winter at 95 to 98%. So if you get just a little bit extra, you're very close to the point of collapse. Italians were the first to be hit in Europe. So they said we need to admit these people to the hospital even if they had modest or not so severe symptoms. By admitting these mild or moderate cases very quickly, they became saturated. And when they started getting the severe cases, they just had no room for them. So also the hospital became heavily colonized with that new virus. This is a virus that can stay on surfaces. Many of their medical personnel got infected in that heavily infested environment. About 3,000 people in the medical personnel in Italy got infected, and they had to leave the battle to be in quarantine, making things even worse. So there's a lot of factors that created like the perfect storm.
This analysis puts everything in perspective. Italy's dysfunctional healthcare system made too many mistakes in the fight against COVID-19, which in turn resulted in a higher death rate among their unusually old and sickly population. However, this unique combination of factors is not present elsewhere in the world, which is why Italy's experience with COVID-19 should have never been used as justification to lock down the rest of the planet. In fact, time has proven that other countries are well prepared to cope with much more severe flu seasons, without the need for implementing any lockdown measures. One such historical example from Germany was given by Dr. Karen Mulling, award-winning virologist, and former director of the Institute of Medical Virology at the University of Zurich. The 2018 influenza epidemic, with 25,000 deaths, never disconcerted the press. The clinics had to deal with an additional 60,000 patients, which was not a problem. This is presented as a terrible disease, but it is like the flu in a normal winter.
I think what we're seeing is a tsunami of a usually quite mild disease, which is sweeping over Europe, and some countries do this, and some countries do that, and some countries don't do that, and in the end there will be very, very little difference.
So when you say it's a usually quite mild disease, what do you mean by that?
That most people who get it will never even notice they were infected.
So does that mean that you think the actual fatality rate of this disease is much lower than the numbers that have been talked about?
Much, much lower.
So do you have you made any speculations as to what sort of zone the real fatality rate might be in?
I think it will be like a severe influenza season, the same as which would be on an order of 0.1% maybe.
There is nothing to be scared about. This is a flu epidemic like every other flu, maybe a bit more severe, but nothing that is fundamentally different from the flus that we see in other years.
At the beginning of this pandemic, people were worried that this was a very severe, very serious virus, a new plague. It isn't. It's quite clear that the infection fatality rate is comparable with flu. You can argue about whether it's a bit more or a bit less, but basically it's not a lot more, even in the vulnerable groups. And in many groups of younger people, it's a lot lower. So the fact is that for people under 70, the infection fatality rate for this disease is 0.05%, which is about half of flu. The fact is, when you get to in your 80s, you have a high chance of dying of all diseases. In the UK, at least, the average age of death is about 82. The average age of death of COVID is a bit older than the average age of death. So the fact is there's no evidence that COVID is really impacting on the overall lifespan of the population.
In March 2021, Professor John Ioannidis published his second meta-analysis, combining data from hundreds of studies from all across the globe. The final conclusion was that the available evidence suggests average global infection fatality rate of about 0.15%, which is in the ballpark of influenza. This crucial evidence showing that COVID-19 is about as deadly as the regular flu has largely been censored by the social media platforms. On numerous occasions, videos of doctors sharing their professional opinions on the novel coronavirus were removed, only because they contradicted the official narrative. Likewise, the mainstream media have also done their best to discourage any debate on the topic. Moreover, ever since the outbreak began, we have all been subjected to a relentless 24/7 fear-mongering propaganda, which was even admitted by a CNN director during a secret video recording.
COVID, gangbusters of ratings, right? Which is why we constantly have the death toll on the side, which I have a major problem with, that we're tallying how many people die every day. Because I've even looked at it and be like, let's make it higher. Like, why isn't it high enough, today? Like, it would make our point better if it was higher. And I'm like, what am I rallying for? That's a problem. Yeah. We're doing that,
In a mortality rate of 1%, that's 400,000 people, potentially.
More deadly than the seasonal flu. 381 deaths were recorded.
We need to preserve our current medical system.
2,663 people have now died.
The death toll is now over 8,000.
2.2 million people would have died in a short period of time.
Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time.
There's a name behind every case.
Boom, fever.
You know you're gonna die.
I was on full life support.
I won't ever see them again.
It's time to listen to what the top doctors are saying.
We really need to all stay at home.
Stay away from each other.
Please, none of you take any chances.
It's like 10 times stronger than the flu.
Coronavirus wants to kill you.
And it's absolutely true that with 24/7 news coverage on the coronavirus, we are getting a distortion and an amplification of the magnitude of this one risk. You're not hearing about every car crash that kills somebody. You're not hearing about every heart attack that kills somebody. You're not hearing about every stroke, every new diagnosis of cancer. And you could be given the impression, if the media were to cover any one of these leading causes of mortality or morbidity with the intensity and ferocity that everyone's now covering coronavirus, you might freak out over any of them. Oh my God, another suicide. We have an epidemic of suicide. What's going on? We have an epidemic of heart attacks. What's going on? We're not doing that. So there is a distortion here.
Or an epidemic of flu deaths, right?
Or an epidemic of flu deaths.
I'm worried that if we see in the news presentations of single cases as heralded being something that I have never seen before, this is so horrible, that's the worst case of severe respiratory distress syndrome that I have seen, we're falling into a trap of sensationalism. We're trying to make sensational comments about every single death that is happening, but just describing single cases one at a time with screams of horror is not something that helps.
The bad thing is that for the media, only a bad story is a good story. So they pick these isolated events of personal and highly emotional experiences. And I don't say it's not there, but it's not representative. It's not typical. Tragic stories happen all the time. We learn from it and we try to prevent it from happening again. But we are not saying, oh, now we have to change our entire life because there was a flu during the flu season.
First, I want to say that in 30 years of public health medicine, I have never seen anything like this, anything anywhere near like this. And I'm not talking about the pandemic, because I've seen 30 of them, one every year. It's called influenza and other respiratory illness viruses that we don't always know what they are. but I've never seen this reaction, and I'm trying to understand why.
And this reminds me of this fairy tale about the king with no clothes. And just the small child was able to say, "Hey, he is naked." All the others on the courtyard surrounding the government and asking the government for advice because they can't know themselves, they all played along and joined the hype. And like this, politicians are being courted by many scientists. Scientists who want to be important in politics because they need money for their institutions. Scientists who just swim along in this mainstream and also want their part. We can help too. Oh, we made an app. Oh, we have a program for this. So many people saying, hey, we want to help too, because they want to earn money with it and become important. And what is missing at the moment is a rational way of looking at things. And the king is naked.
By this point, it should have become evident that the public's distorted perception of COVID-19's lethality is based on erroneous epidemiological models and media hype. But is there any truth to the claim that the novel coronavirus is much more infectious than the seasonal flu? It is well established among infectious disease experts that in most instances influenza spreads when symptomatic people cough, sneeze and exhale the virus, infecting others in the process. However, there is also some evidence suggesting that asymptomatic infected individuals also shed viral particles and could potentially transmit the flu to others. The Center for Disease Control agrees that some people can be infected with the flu virus, but have no symptoms. During this time, those people may still spread the virus to others. It is not clear exactly how rare it is for asymptomatic individuals to spread influenza. When it comes to COVID-19, it seems that the main driver of the pandemic is symptomatic transmission, whereas asymptomatic transmission can occur only in rare instances.
What proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit? So the way that we look at that is we look at these individuals need to be followed carefully over the course of when they're detected and looking at secondary transmission. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And that much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward.
Another piece of evidence comes from the Chinese city Wuhan, the initial COVID-19 hotspot. In a study conducted between May 14 and June 1, almost the entire population of 10 million people was tested, and only 300 asymptomatic infections were found. The paper goes on to explain, a total of 1,174 close contacts of the asymptomatic positive cases were traced, and they all tested negative for the COVID-19. Given all this, it appears that asymptomatic transmission plays an insignificant role in the way SARS-CoV-2 spreads among the population. This means that the concept of asymptomatic super spreaders is completely false, and there is absolutely no reason to keep healthy people under lockdown. But what part do children play in the transmission process? The answer to this question was given by the extensive study conducted in Iceland. As National Geographic points out, this 40,000-person study found that children under 15 were about half as likely as adults to be infected, and only half as likely as adults to transmit the virus to others. Almost all the coronavirus transmissions to children came from adults. In addition to this, the Center for Disease Control has clearly stated on their website that the risk of complications for healthy children is higher for flu compared to COVID-19. Young children are at higher risk of severe illness from flu. This of course brings us to the inevitable question: why have politicians been so insistent on keeping schools closed, when such measures have never been implemented for a prolonged period of time, in any flu epidemic in the past? And is there any scientific evidence that justifies countermeasures such as mask wearing? From the very start of the pandemic, face masks have become one of the most debated topics in society. During the early stages of the outbreak, medical authorities such as the WHO and even Dr. Anthony Fauci, the main COVID-19 medical advisor in the U.S., were adamant that face masks will not protect people from the novel coronavirus.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
At the time, such strong skepticism among health authorities was based on the fact that decades of scientific research had failed to show any significant benefit from the use of facial coverings. In February 2020, the University of Hong Kong, with support from the World Health Organization, published an extensive meta-analysis which came to the following conclusion. In our systematic review, we identified 10 randomized controlled trials that reported estimates of the effectiveness of face masks in reducing laboratory-confirmed influenza virus infections in the community, from literature published during 1946 to July 27, 2018. In pooled analysis, we found no significant reduction in influenza transmission with the use of face masks. Surprisingly, within weeks the medical officials changed their stance and began recommending facial coverings for everyone, promoting them as a highly effective and safe measure against SARS-CoV-2. This sudden change of opinion was confusing, if not downright suspicious, given that the scientific data on the topic had not changed even one bit during this short time frame.
It seems that we're now being asked to wear masks on the street, no matter what we're doing. What do you make of all this, and how should we respond?
It's ridiculous.
And just when authorities were in dire need to justify their experimental COVID policies, a large meta-study funded by the WHO was published in the Lancet Medical Journal, showing that masks are a highly effective countermeasure against SARS-CoV-2 infection. However, many researchers have pointed out the obvious flaws, statistical errors, and misinterpretations made by the authors of the paper. For example, of the 29 studies included in the meta-analysis, all studies are non-randomized, 7 are non-peer-reviewed observational studies, and 25 are about SARS-1 virus or the MERS virus, both of which have very different transmission characteristics to SARS-CoV-2. Against all common sense, the Lancet paper was never retracted, and went on to have an enormous impact on COVID policies worldwide. However, only a few months later, the largest randomized controlled trial on face masks was conducted in Denmark. The results showed that the subjects who wore a mask were just as likely to catch SARS-CoV-2 as those who did not wear a mask. When it comes to the use of personal protective equipment, such as face masks, nobody is more qualified and knowledgeable than industrial hygienists. Their job is to analyze and help eliminate workplace hazards that can cause sickness in workers. Even medical doctors and nurses get their training from industrial hygienists on how to properly use face masks.
When you're dealing with infectious disease patients, these are not the masks that you wear. Even N95s are not fully rated to protect against a virus. These micron sizes, again, they're not rated by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They're not approved for this use, so not only is this a bad idea, there's numerous studies for years based off of the flu outbreaks across the world several years ago that not only do these ear loop masks and cloth masks not work, they're increasing the spread through fomite transmission, which is a form of cross-contamination. You're touching your face. No one is trained on when you're supposed to change these out. No one is trained that when they're soiled or you're working in a humid environment. These things increase the spread. You re-inhale your exhausted gaseous waste, and you can increase your viral load. So if you are ill, not only can you continue to spread it, because you're not understanding the hand hygiene aspect of that, but you will be sicker longer.
Furthermore, facial coverings also result in levels of carbon dioxide of more than 5,000 parts per million, which is toxic, and leads to oxygen deprivation and numerous potential health hazards. This test clearly shows that there are no safe masks.
Did I just get an incorrect reading? Is that not how you would do this?
No, we saw that and we were like, he's doing it right.
Del, you did it exactly right. In the world of industrial hygiene, and I'm a senior industrial hygienist, when you are going to test breathing environments or hazards that can be inhaled, you test in the breathing zone.
That oxygen deprivation over long periods, not only is it immediately, you have that acute immediate issue with headaches and fatigue and nausea and things like that, but you're creating long-term health effects too. When you deprive the body of oxygen for a long period of time, it reduces immune function, it causes cancer to be able to grow and thrive, a more acidic environment, because you're increasing also the CO2, which causes hypercapnia and all of that.
Considering the ample evidence of the dangers and lack of efficacy of face masks, making them mandatory for everyone, including children at school, is totally unjustified and extremely irresponsible. And perhaps it should come as no surprise that unfathomable amounts of government money are given to the schools that implement all these measures.
So we looked into the ESSER 3 money, which is the most schools are given. In Tennessee, Shelby County, Memphis, Shelby County gets almost $750 million in COVID relief funds. To get this money, they have to do these things: universal and correct wearing of masks, physical distancing, hand washing, cleaning, ventilation, contact tracing, quarantines, isolation, and the second to last on the list is vaccinations. This is why they're getting the money.
While health authorities were insisting that we should all stay at home and follow the lockdown rules, it turned out that they are the ones who have a hard time doing just that. Among them was none other than Professor Neil Ferguson, the infamous British epidemiologist, whose model advocated for the implementation of full lockdowns and social distancing, was caught meeting with his married lover. As a result, Ferguson resigned from his position as an advisor on COVID-19. In a similar way, many government officials such as presidents, governors, mayors and medical authorities were caught breaking the lockdown rules, which they strongly promoted as life-saving. This proves that these people are nothing but outright hypocrites who don't even believe their own lies. Throughout 2020 and 2021, authorities adamantly refused to fulfill their promises of complete reopening of society. Needless to say, the draconian lockdowns have caused devastating ripple effects that will be felt for generations to come. First and foremost, the crisis has resulted in the most staggering wealth redistribution in human history. As reported by the Institute for Policy Studies, between March 18, 2020, and January 18, 2021, the combined wealth of the more than 600 U.S. billionaires increased by 39%, from approximately $2.95 trillion to $4.1 trillion. The richest five, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Elon Musk, saw an incredible 85% increase in their total wealth, from $358 billion to $661 billion. In contrast to this, during the same period, a staggering 76 million Americans have filed for unemployment. To put this into perspective, in the state of Colorado, in only a single week, more citizens filed for unemployment than throughout the entire 2019. A similar catastrophic scenario has also unfolded in the rest of the states.
Where the lines to get free food were half a mile long. Half a mile. From New York,
there are still quite a few cars out here.
To Texas,
hundreds at least still in line.
California,
110 tons of food distributed to Hawaii residents.
And Hawaii, no state spared from the fallout of COVID-19. America is in a pandemic of hunger, food lines never ending. These news reports are from the start of the pandemic. Since then, the need has only gotten worse.
Feeding Tampa Bay held what they call a mega pantry.
Tampa Bay is no different. The high cost of our war against COVID-19, leaving some families broke, destitute, homeless, and unable to buy food. Pre-COVID, 600,000 people in our area were food insecure. Now, 1 million plus and growing.
Elsewhere in the world, the lockdowns have also massively increased the gap between the rich and the poor. According to the non-profit organization Oxfam, between March 18 and the end of 2020, the combined wealth of all billionaires around the globe increased by $3.9 trillion. By comparison, during this time, the total earnings of workers worldwide fell by $3.7 trillion, as millions of people lost their jobs. The United Nations World Food Programme currently puts the number of people at risk of starvation at more than 270 million. This is 2 times higher than the pre-pandemic figure.
At one point during the day, the line of people awaiting a food handout stretched 2.5 miles. But the length of the queue wasn't the only shock. The other was where it formed, for this is just outside Johannesburg, the richest city in Africa. These pictures show Kenyans so hungry they couldn't wait, and so they stampeded. Such was their fear of missing out on food being distributed. The UN says 5 African countries are at risk of famines of biblical proportions, but neither Kenya nor South Africa are among them. South Sudan is. Already cursed by war, climate change, and a dire economy, the country is home to 1.7 million displaced people living in camps. Most have to work to eat, but because of coronavirus, they're doing less of both. Because of the movement restrictions, we can't leave the camp to work, said this woman. We're running out of food and medicine and hope aid organizations will rescue us. The quarantine and a broken food supply chain complete a perfect storm of man-made and natural disasters that condemn perhaps millions to starvation.
The sharp increase in poverty during the lockdowns has directly resulted in a significant spike in child trafficking in some developing nations such as India. Desperate families have decided to let their kids work dangerous jobs, in hopes of getting a little bit of money and food in return. Another worrying trend that has emerged during the lockdowns is the steep decline in mental health. The scientific journal Nature announced that more than 42% of people surveyed by the U.S. Census Bureau in December reported symptoms of anxiety or depression in December, an increase from 11% the previous year. Data from other surveys suggest that the picture is similar worldwide. Unsurprisingly, there is also a significant rise in alcohol abuse and domestic violence. But even more worrying is the huge spike in drug overdose deaths in 2020 compared to the previous year. In the US, there was a 33% increase on average, with some states reaching a mind-numbing 60% increase. The only place where drug overdose deaths have declined during the pandemic is South Dakota, one of the few states that refuse to issue stay-at-home orders. Yet another devastating effect of the draconian measures has to do with the terrible disruption of the medical system. In England alone, around 4.7 million people were waiting for routine operations and procedures in February 2021. In many places around the world, life-saving surgeries and treatments have been delayed and even cancelled, leading to the unnecessary suffering and death of hundreds of thousands of people.
Doctors say a new crisis is brewing, a massive backlog of cancer surgeries derailed by COVID-19. And a recent study from Ontario shows there was a dramatic 60% drop in cancer surgeries when the pandemic began, and medical teams were deployed to fight the virus. The result, some 36,000 fewer surgeries were performed last spring compared to the year before.
That's a staggering number, and that's in Ontario alone, in a very short period of time.
And they've become part of an enormous and growing backlog of patients waiting for a variety of surgeries. Over 250,000 people in Ontario alone standing by for their operations.
It's almost impossible to recover from this type of a backlog. Even if we were to operate on Saturdays and Sundays and into the evenings every day, which we don't have the capacity for, we could not do that even if we wanted to.
Another physician I talked to is a board-certified orthopedic surgeon out of Texas, and I said, how's it going? He said, well, I did a case a few weeks ago that they considered non-essential, and I got a letter stating that if I do any more cases, I could be fined and/or imprisoned for helping people with a limb that was non-functional, because that was considered non-essential. So when we see this kind of thing start happening time and time again, we have to ask ourselves, is the collateral damage of COVID indeed worse than the COVID virus itself?
Fellow citizens, erroneous beliefs in medicine have caused undescribable suffering to countless inhabitants on this earth.
All we've really done, you're suggesting, in addition to not adequately protecting the old, we have slowed the spread of herd immunity.
Yes, and that means we have increased the risk of the elderly to become infected. because you cannot isolate yourself for extended periods of time. We have wasted a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of lives, a lot of everything.
According to an analysis done by the highly respected National Bureau of Economic Research, in the period between April 2020 and the end of 2021, the lockdown policies have caused at least 171,000 non-COVID excess deaths in the United States alone.
What should we do right now? I mean, it seems that the flatter the curve gets and the less deaths there are, the more lockdown measures are being put in place.
We should go back to be a strong economy, to work, to have a social life, to let children being educated, do everything our society should do. And that lockdown there's no benefit, it has only negative effects.
Professor Knut Witkowski does not stand alone in his emotional plea to authorities to end the lockdowns. On May 19, 2020, a group of 600 doctors signed an open letter to President Donald Trump, calling for the end of lockdowns, which they referred to as a mass casualty incident. Unfortunately, American authorities turned a blind eye to this important declaration. A similar open letter, this time addressed to the Belgian government, was written on September 5, 2020. And eventually signed by over 700 medical doctors. The document states, "We find it shocking that the government is invoking health as a reason for the emergency law. As doctors and health professionals, in the face of a virus which, in terms of its harmfulness, mortality and transmissibility, approaches the seasonal influenza, we can only reject these extremely disproportionate measures. We therefore demand an immediate end to all measures. We are questioning the legitimacy of the current advisory experts, who meet behind closed doors. We call for an in-depth examination of the role of the WHO, and the possible influence of conflicts of interest in this organization." It was also at the heart of the fight against the infodemic, i.e. the systematic censorship of all dissenting opinions in the media. This is unacceptable for a democratic state, governed by the rule of law. Yet again, the demands of hundreds of medical professionals fell on deaf ears. About a month later, on October 4, 3 world-renowned epidemiologists, Professor Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, Professor Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University, and Professor Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University, wrote and signed the Great Barrington Declaration, which asserts the following. We know that vulnerability to death from COVID-19 is more than 1,000-fold higher in the old and infirm than the young. Indeed, for children, COVID-19 is less dangerous than many other harms, including influenza. The most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection, while better protecting those who are at highest risk. We call this focused protection. At the core of this approach is the concept of herd immunity, a normal biological phenomenon, which epidemiology has recognized long time ago.
With all respiratory diseases, the only thing that stops the disease is herd immunity. About 80% of the people need to have had contact with the virus, and the majority of them won't even have recognized that they were infected, or they had very, very mild symptoms, especially if they're children. So it's very important to keep the schools open and kids mingling, to spread the virus, to get herd immunity as fast as possible. And then the elderly people who should be separated and the nursing homes should be closed during that time can come back and meet their children and grandchildren after about 4 weeks when the virus has been exterminated.
Only a few days after the Great Barrington Declaration was written, the University of Arizona published compelling research, clearly showing that we can develop natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2.
What we found is that everyone who had been confirmed to have been infected by the virus, even people who had no symptoms whatsoever, made a really nice antibody response. And they all made antibodies that kept the virus from infecting cells. What we also found is that everyone maintains those antibodies for as long as we've been able to look.
We cannot really put a solid number on how long this immunity is going to last. What we know is what we have measured, which is like that it is at least 6 to 7 months.
In the next few months, these crucial findings were confirmed by a study conducted by the National Institute of Health in the U.S., and 2 more papers published in the Lancet Medical Journal. Additionally, the Journal of Clinical Investigation put out a study, which found that the immune system of most people who have never been infected with SARS-CoV-2 can still recognize the novel coronavirus and provide immunity against it. It should be noted that even the World Health Organization has recognized these scientific findings. The evidence has compelled more than 40,000 medical practitioners from all over the world to sign the Great Barrington Declaration. Among them are many leading experts in the fields of virology, microbiology, epidemiology, and immunology. However, instead of embracing the focused protection approach proposed in the document, the mainstream media has viciously attacked it, calling it dangerous and irresponsible. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization shocked the world of science when they changed the definition of herd immunity. In June 2020, their website explained the concept in the following way. Herd immunity is the indirect protection from an infectious disease that happens when a population is immune, either through vaccination or immunity developed through previous infection. However, several months later, the WHO changed the text to herd immunity, also known as population immunity, is a concept used for vaccination, in which a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached. Herd immunity is achieved by protecting people from a virus, not by exposing them to it. This blatant and disgusting attempt by the WHO to erase the fundamental biological fact that herd immunity can be achieved naturally, without the need of vaccines, proves once again that the organization is driven by financial and political interests, not by science. To understand how society can rely mostly on natural herd immunity, we should look no further than Sweden.
Please describe the strategy chosen by Sweden and what is it telling us now?
Sweden was one of the countries that chose a less restrictive approach. It kept much of its society and of its economy open. It allowed most schools, kindergarten and elementary school and middle school to be open. It kept most shops open and bars and restaurants, although with some modest restrictions. It also allowed people to get together but not exceed a limit of 50 people. So in a way, it is very different compared to the draconian measures that were implemented with very fierce lockdown measures in other countries in Europe and in many places in the US. They have done fairly well. And of course, it is very difficult to compare one country against another because you expect to see large diversity in infection rates and also in death rates. A country like Norway, for example, where the average Norwegian is likely to see very few other people. It's very sparsely populated compared to Stockholm is not something that you can compare head to head. Maybe you can compare Sweden against Switzerland, for example, that had very draconian measures very early on, and the death rate per million population is slightly higher, a bit higher in Switzerland compared to Sweden until now.
Another nation which decided to tackle COVID-19 through naturally acquired herd immunity is Belarus. The small European country did not impose any restrictions on everyday social activities. Businesses remained open, and public gatherings, including professional sport events, were allowed. The country's medical system was perfectly capable of dealing with COVID-19, and it never got overwhelmed with patients. Needless to say, there were no military trucks carrying dead bodies, and no mass graves were dug. In fact, by the end of June 2021, Belarus had registered only 334 coronavirus deaths per 1 million population, one of the lowest in Europe, and 102nd in the world. Further evidence for the effectiveness of the natural herd immunity approach is the fact that all-cause mortality in Belarus in 2020 was 12.5 deaths per 1,000 inhabitants, the same as in the previous 2 years, and the lowest since 1992. Despite the country's incredibly successful handling of COVID-19, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has been heavily criticized by mainstream media and pressured by Western powers to change course. He even admitted during a press conference that the World Bank, one of the branches of the United Nations, offered him almost $1 billion to impose strict lockdowns like in Italy.
В борьбе с коронавирусом в Беларуси делайте как в Италии.
Many have suspected that Lukashenko's refusal to comply with the global lockdown agenda is one of the main catalysts for the attempted overthrow of his government in the summer of 2020. Similar negative chain of events have also occurred in other countries whose leaders have decided not to impose any pandemic-related restrictions. The Republic of Burundi is a perfect example of this. In May 2020, the government expelled WHO officials from the country because of their unacceptable interference with the nation's COVID response. Less than a month later, President Pierre Nkurunziza died of a cardiac arrest at the age of 55. Another African government which decided to not follow WHO's recommendations and allowed life to continue as normal is the island of Zanzibar. Sadly, the 77-year-old vice president of the semi-autonomous state, Saif Sharif Hamad, died in February 2021. The media reported that COVID-19 was the cause of death. The next tragic event in Africa involved Tanzania's President John Magufuli. He not only refused to implement lockdowns, but also publicly rejected COVID-19 PCR test kits, claiming that samples taken from a gold and pawpaw fruit returned positive results. Moreover, the president warned Tanzanians of the dangers of the experimental COVID-19 vaccines, insisting that the country will not purchase them. Only days after the death of Zanzibar's vice president, John Magufuli mysteriously disappeared.
No one really knows where or how the Tanzanian president, John Magufuli, is.
Mr. Magufuli hasn't been seen in public for the last 18 days. Being a fervent Catholic, Magufuli would attend church services every Sunday, but he has skipped 3 congregations since March began.
After missing for almost 3 weeks, President John Magufuli was announced to have died from complications of a heart disease. 4 months later, Tanzania began its first mass vaccination campaign. Meanwhile, more than 7,000 miles away, the Haitian president removed all lockdown restrictions and refused to purchase coronavirus vaccines, insisting that his people successfully treat COVID-19 with herbal remedies.
One of the lowest death rates from COVID-19 in the world, and scientists are mystified about why. Most people have given up on masks, and those who do wear them don't always believe the virus is real. In our one and only interview, Haiti's president talks about why his government hasn't administered a single vaccine and doesn't plan to.
On July 7, 2021, a hit squad of nearly 30 men assassinated Haiti's president after entering his home residence. Not long after, mainstream media reported that several of the gunmen used to work as informants for the United States law enforcement agencies, DEA and FBI. Only 1 week after the murder, Haiti received its first shipment of coronavirus vaccine vials. We might never know for sure if these country leaders have become victims of covert political revenge, or if it's all just a chain of unfortunate events.